Daryl Wanzer Serrano.
I'm Ariana Ruiz.
I'm Renee Rocha.
And this is Imagining Latinidades. Thank you so much for joining us on the Imagining Latinidades podcast. This is Daryl Wanzer Serrano, and I am joined today by an amazing guest who happens to be on campus as part of our film series for Imagining Latinidades, and that person is Iris Morales.
Hello, Daryl. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here as part of Latinidades and to be able to show Palante, Siempre Palante. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for coming. I've been wanting to bring you to campus for a very long time, and so it's nice to have the opportunity to finally do it, and to be able to show your film and have you here for a Q&A afterward. So there's like a million things I would want to talk with you about, and you know, we could probably do an entire podcast series of just conversations about stuff, because you have an amazing life that is full of activism and organizing, and really just like, you know, making such a significant difference in people's lives. I mean, I know that personally just from the difference you've made in my life, ever since we started chatting about the Young Lords a while ago, 15, 16 years ago, something like that.
It's been a minute.
It's been a minute. But today, what I'd really like to talk with you about is student organizing and connections between, you know, Puerto Rican studies, Latinx studies, and the broader communities that those fields emerge from and speak to, both inside and outside of academia. You know, this is a theme that we've talked about on this podcast and in our Imagining Latinidades programming across this year. It's a theme that's really important to us because, you know, from our perspective, and I think from history's perspective, and I think you share this perspective too, you know, Puerto Rican studies, Chicano studies, Latinx studies doesn't emerge out of a vacuum. It's not a purely academic exercise. The fact of the matter is that these fields don't exist without organizing and agitation from students and from broader communities, right? And so, you know, as we're celebrating this year the 50th anniversary of Black and Puerto Rican Studies at, you know, in CUNY, and as we've been celebrating these kinds of things over the last year or so, the 50th anniversary of the Young Lords in New York, you know, it's important to recognize that this stuff doesn't happen in the academic context without these broader kinds of social movements providing the scaffolding, right, for the ideas to then emerge within the academic context. And there has to be a reciprocal relationship there too, right? That once it does emerge in that academic context, there seems to me at least, there's a responsibility to engage, to not just engage those ideas in the vacuum of the academy, but to engage those ideas in a way that maintains and cultivates that connection to community. So that's the kind of like impetus. That's the setup for my question. But my question is really,
I thought that was your question.
well, I mean, I'd like to get you to historicize it a little bit, because, like, you know, you were there, right? I mean, you're there as these ideas are bubbling to the surface, and not in a passive way, right? You're instigating these ideas coming to the surface. You're part of the group of people who's making demands, right, in the CUNY system, to have, you know, to make Puerto Rican seen, right, and to make the kind of like our presence like valued and important in an educational context. So like, you were there, and I want to hear more about that. I think our listeners want to hear more about that.
Well, you know me, and so you know that I will start from the perspective that we were part of of a specific time where there was a lot of movement happening and there was a lot of change happening in this country. And so I want to position the struggle for Puerto Rican studies and Black studies and all the other studies that we have now that we didn't even envision at that point within that context, that we were part of something bigger and something broader in the society.
Yeah.
Because these movements, these historical points come around every so often, or we make them, or we pressure them, or we shape them. They're not always there, and sometimes in the quiet moments, we don't realize that those are also opportunities for when those bigger movements or more pressing movements come to the fore. And so the war in Vietnam was impacting our communities. You know, it was poor working class, young Black and brown men that were going to fight that war. And in New York City in particular, the situation for young Puerto Ricans was not great. We became the generation that started to go into the universities. So we were also the generation, because our parents came from Puerto Rico and our parents were part of this huge migration. They came with all the hope for us, who that generation suffered discrimination, suffered horrible working conditions, and we were able to see that. You know, I always think of how I translated. As a matter of fact, in the Palante book, the first book, that's what I talk about, being the go-between, the translator. And I think what I say about that is that I was able to see racism, exploitation up front from a very young age. That influenced me individually, but I think that was the experience that our generation was going through. And so by the time we get to the university, and City University at that point, which was a public university that had been schooling immigrants, European immigrants, for generations, it was free university. And we were finding that maybe we had 3% African American and Puerto Rican at that time student population within that university system. And by way of backstory, there were other players.
Sure.
Right. So there were educators, our elders concerned about what was happening with Black and brown youth and our opportunities for education. And there were also some legislators that were concerned. And I bring these pieces into play because it took a lot of different, we hear about the demonstrations, but it took a lot of different pieces to make this happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
And not everybody is at the front lines. Not everybody's at the picket line. And sometimes people are someplace else, but they're doing something good, Mm-hmm. And sometimes we have a tendency not to recognize, or we have a tendency to think that there's not value in that. Obviously, I'm a frontlines person, and, that's where I can make my contribution. That's where I did. But so we were part of this generation that had to fight even to get through the front door. And so these other folks were in the background trying to set up programs in the City University. I want to mention this because this core of young people that were brought into the university through special pilot programs for underprivileged, deprived, or whatever else words they use for us, brought in Black and brown working class kids into the university, who then stood there, took the classes, and looked around and said, whoa, there's nothing here that talks about my experience. All that I see here kind of diminishes who I am. Yeah. And so at City College, that was manifested in something called the pre-baccalaureate program, where 117 students, primarily Black and Puerto Rican, were admitted. Students that could not have made it in through the regular criteria at that time. Mm-hmm. So definitely we were a backdoor, we were treated like a backdoor. But as I said yesterday, you may come in the back door, but you have to go out the front door. They're not going to let you out the back door. You got to go out the front door. Same thing happened in law school. People, you're coming in through the back door. I said, yeah, but you got to take that bar exam like everybody else. And they put your name in the New York Times if you pass, and if you fail, everybody knows it because your name's not there. Mm-hmm. So we quickly became concerned by the low numbers of Black and Puerto Rican students. When the public high school population was 70%, and yet in the university you had 3%.
Yeah.
We also became concerned that there were no classes. I told the story, the first class that they offered us was a Puerto Rican studies class that they titled From Pre-Columbus to 1898. And we said, whoa, that does not make any sense. And we were hungry. We were a generation that was hungry.
Yeah.
And this kind of inquiry was taking place at all the universities with, African American and Latino students everywhere. So I was at the 50th anniversary in Austin, Texas, mm-hmm. earlier this year, and at Hunter College and at City College we had our 50th. So this has been the year to celebrate. But all over the country, these activities in California, we had some of the first with Chicano students. So, and we were aware that we were, that we were looking to each other. We were learning our own history from each other because we didn't have the books.
Yeah.
I mentioned that the Center for Puerto Rican Studies was developed in 1973, and I'm talking about, 65.
Yeah.
So we had no books on this. And we were hungry, so we were teaching each other. We'd say, oh, Julio knows history. Why don't we get him to come? So Julio would come, and 50 of us would be sitting there, and he would be rapping Puerto Rican history, and we'd be asking him questions, and we'd be like, we were in heaven learning our history and learning that we had done things, that learning why our parents were here, right? Because we had been led to believe that our parents were inadequate, and that's why we were poor. Mm-hmm. So we started organizing, and at most of the city universities, you had some type of African American organization. But at that time, as I said, in terms of Puerto Ricans, we were the first big group coming through. There had been other Puerto Ricans, and we looked at them with awe. We knew all their names. Oh, so-and-so went to this school. Really? He was Puerto Rican? Wow, she was Puerto Rican? But they were like few and far between that we heard about. It was like urban legends, to be able to get a degree. And remember, all of our families aspired like, if they could get more education. My mother had a 3rd grade education. My father had a 6th grade. So they were, wow, if she could get more education. Yeah. And so we organized, and we started to negotiate with the administration and put together our demands, which included things like Puerto Rican and Black studies, included the hiring of Puerto Rican and Black faculty and administration. We had a particular demand that education majors should be studying Puerto Rican history mm-hmm. and Black history, which is not a demand that usually people hear about, but that is very important.
Oh, it's so important. I mean, not to derail, but this is something that I've been ranting about here at Iowa, because the population of primary schoolers, right, is pretty rapidly changing here in Iowa,
right?
And I don't think education is keeping up. I mean,
Right.
you look at the demographics and the College of Education here, and it has one of the lowest populations of Latino students, right? The College of Liberal Arts and Sciences has one of the highest, but it's only maybe, I think it's somewhere around 3% students. And I don't know that they have any faculty, right, who are, Latinx faculty who are teaching the future teachers, right, who are in those education preparation programs. And, there are school districts that are 25%, Latino students here in Iowa.
Yep. It's a big problem, and I think we recognized it from our own experience, having been in the public school system.
Yeah.
We recognized it. I know when I was in the Young Lords, I mentioned to you yesterday that one of the first things that I did was to come in and help some of the Young Lords that were becoming members to learn how to read and write. Because we had young people that had been through the school system that didn't know how to read and write.
Yeah.
And so we did it with the Red Book. We did it with materials that were relevant to people, and people learned how to read and write, and then went on to learn how to read, political economy and things that are usually people think only people in college can read. Mm-hmm. So, but we understood how important that was, and there were so many of us, and that became one of our demands. The other demand that I always find like fascinating and so strategic for young people to have come up with this was the demand that the incoming class reflect the population of high school students. So that I always find it fascinating that young people would come up with this particular demand that the entering class reflect, in terms of numbers, reflect the population in the public high schools.
Yeah.
That at that point was like 70%. So that's what we were calling for.
Yeah. That's such a smart strategic demand, because if you just do it by like the population of the state, right?
Exactly.
Then they can get away with nothing, right?
Right.
Or the broader population of the city, even, they can get away with nothing. But
right.
Yeah, that's really smart.
That was very, very smart. I don't remember who came up with it, because, these conversations were collective and individual, but they were also, as in any movement, they were also developing and evolving over time. So the time period here might have been 2 years, mm-hmm. but it's important to know that you don't sit down one day, pop up, and then you create a movement.
Right.
And I mention that because I've been places, and sometimes, students will ask me questions like that, with the enthusiasm of wanting to get going right away. And I say, these things do take. We have to organize ourselves, and then we have to see who our allies are. And one of the things that was very important about City College is that we were in Harlem. Mm-hmm. We were up on the hill in Harlem. And great writers had written about the university up on the hill, going back to the Harlem Renaissance. Mm-hmm. And so there were eyes on City College and mm-hmm. what was happening there, both with these students that had come in as, through the back door, so to speak, and through their demands and through the demands of the community. We had a lot of support from the community, people bringing us food. And I think it's those connections are extremely important to me. These movements come from the people. Mm-hmm. They reflect the desires and needs of the people. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes they sustain, and sometimes they become something else.
Yeah. And I want to come back to that point. But one thing that you mentioned to when you visited my class yesterday that I think is really important here too is that it also involves training that next generation, especially when you're talking about educational context where, people are only here for theoretically 4 years, usually 5 years, sometimes 6 years. But, there's a lot of turnover, and it's easy. I think what you said yesterday was, it's easy for the administration to just kind of wait you out.
Exactly, right? Exactly. And that happens everywhere. And that's always, something that you have to keep into account in your organizing. Sometimes I think our organizing has kind of, I don't know what you call this around it. What would you call this kind of blinders on? That we just see what's immediately to the side and in front of us without seeing what's on top and what's at the bottom and what's like three-dimensional.
Yeah, you get kind of a tunnel vision and just focus on that thing that's most present to you right at that moment.
Yeah, and so I encourage multidimensional thinking because at the same time that there's that strategy, then we have to counter a different strategy that says, as those young people come in, start training them, developing them, but also recognizing as part of that training that conditions change. So, for example, in the city university that I'm familiar with, the student population started to change. So now it wasn't just Puerto Ricans. You had Dominicans, you had Africans, you had other folks coming in. And then that also affected the student organizing because all of a sudden people started organizing, the Dominican student organization, the Puerto Rican student, the Caribbean student organization, all these different parts. And when I speak, I say you have 3 people in each organization.
Yeah.
Why not everybody come together? I mean, and so the administration is able to take advantage of that too, just like in the broader society.
Sure.
And it doesn't mean we all have to be in the same thing, but we have to be able to work together.
Yeah.
I think that the other very important thing about these student struggles was the unity with Black and Puerto Rican students. And we had differences, and sometimes, the Puerto Ricans were thinking like, well, they put us second and we don't want to be second, or the African Americans would say, well, they're riding on our coattails, and there would be a lot of negotiation. I'm not trying to make it sound like it was a walk in the park either. Because we have to be real, and sometimes if we're not real, then we're not believable. So, but we work through those. Why? Because what we had in common, what we would gain, was bigger than all of that. And that was also, for young people to recognize that was very significant. And I think part of that development was because of the moment that we were living in terms of history and what was happening in the world. If you think about it, the 60s and the 70s, we're still living with a lot of gains that were made during that time, with a lot of changes, a lot of those legacies. I mean, people still reference those. The individuals and the movements and the cultural changes that and thinking and the individual freedoms and all of that that has to go into the mix, and we were part of that. So then the city college took over, formed the committee of 10, put forward 5 demands, closed the campus, had allies in the white student movement. The university was divided between North and South. South was the social sciences. North was the, engineering and so we had a lot of support on the South. Those were the buildings we took over. People were coming with blankets and food, and then the negotiation, and we had the support of these African American and Latino politicians and educators. We had great educators on our side, people that were heading up some of these programs that were set up specifically for Black and Latino students. And so that combination gave us a big win. And also, it was just, and it was time to expand the intellectual knowledge available in a university. How could you argue that? To bring in the histories and the contributions of other peoples. There was a lot of interest in African history at that point, so, I mean, to study all of Africa, we still don't do a good job on that.
Right.
I mean, people talk about Africa like it's one country. Africa is huge.
Right.
And the contributions and the struggles of that continent are monumental. People don't want to talk about that. Latin America. I started to study Latin American history as a result. So it was an important moment for students. And by that time, I was going in another direction, which is I really felt that I wanted to return to the community and do organizing there. I had been a tenant organizer before, came to work with students and then wanted to return back to the community as just where I felt I could continue to make a contribution.
Yeah.
And in working with, in the community, we also worked with students. And one of the organizations that I wanted to highlight that kind of had seeds at that moment, City College kind of led this struggle at that particular moment. And then there were other universities. I mean, every university, the students at every university got into it.
Sure. Yeah.
And out of all of these struggles, the Puerto Rican Student Union developed. And it's been understudied as far as I'm concerned, although I know there's several scholars working on doing some historical research. So, but the Puerto Rican Student Union was made up of working class Puerto Ricans, men and women, and formed on every campus, formed beyond New York City, formed throughout and had chapters in universities throughout the Northeast in particular. And what is so significant to me about them is not only that they fought for the rights of students, but that they really believed that the student struggle was connected to the community struggle.
Yeah.
One of the beautiful things that they did in New York was that they established, there was no lot in the South Bronx. I don't know if you know about it or if you... Anyway, it was all filled with garbage, and they decided to clean it out. And that was part of the student work. You had to, you just automatically, it wasn't that you called it even community work. You just automatically knew that you had to work with your community. It wasn't community service. We didn't call it that. And they cleaned out the lot, and they put murals on the side of one of the buildings, and they named it La Plaza Borinqueña.
Okay.
And we had so many demonstrations and gatherings and community festivals there. It became a viable community space. It was students that created that. And the Puerto Rican Student Union became politicized also and became affiliated with the Young Lords. Yeah. Their platform included not only educational issues. The Puerto Rican Student Union also had an anti-imperialist platform.
Okay.
In other words, they connected the dots of the racism and the miseducation that students were facing with all the other injustices that were taking place.
Okay.
And they participated greatly in the organizing of the demonstration to the United Nations where we had 30,000 people. They were part of co-sponsoring. It was actually Hildemar Ortiz and myself that coordinated the student conference at Columbia University. And the purpose of that conference was to raise, it was the first Puerto Rican student conference.
Yeah.
And now you've had many since then, but it was the first one at Columbia University. Again, we had to gather the forces. We had one or two people, Puerto Ricans at Columbia University, and they helped us get the venue. And then all the chapters brought students, made sure students came from all over. And we had all these conferences, including things like the role of women, which at that time was like, wow, it was very forward thinking. And one of the purposes of the conference was to form Free Puerto Rico Now committees on every campus. So we were connecting our history in Puerto Rico with the diaspora, although we didn't use that terminology at that time, but that's what was happening. We were connecting, and it would be natural for us to connect that because we considered ourselves internationalists. We were connecting with struggles that were happening all over the world, and we were supporting the anti-colonial struggle of the Vietnamese people. So how would we not support the anti-colonial struggle of Puerto Rico?
Yeah.
So we were starting to understand a lot of those concepts and then trying our best to take action because we knew that we had the theoreticians among us. And we said the theory was okay, but theory was not going to make the change. We used to call it armchair revolutionaries. I don't know if you still use that term.
That term still gets used. Yeah, sure.
But it was a very action-oriented time, and it was a very important time for students. And, we're living in another moment where we have to take action because we can't take for granted that what we won yesterday we'll have tomorrow. The struggle is constant.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's, that continues, that point remains important, I think, for a lot of Latinx studies programs, right, today, especially in this era of austerity, where, especially at public universities, right, and colleges, they're constantly looking for, they're constantly having their funding cut by state legislatures, and looking for places to kind of make consolidations and cuts and stuff. It's what makes it a challenge for sure. Like here at Iowa, we're one of the youngest Latino studies programs around, right? This is our fifth year. And we're trying to grow, right? How do you grow, when there's always, the constant pressures to kind of like shrink, right? And so that struggle is kind of an ongoing, always having to find to find and build those coalitions, and to, constantly be making the argument for continued relevance and importance. And that's the kind of like, hearing you talk about the demands that you were making as an undergraduate in the 60s, it reminds me of the same kinds of dynamics and needs that we see here at a place like the University of Iowa today, right? Where, the university's done a pretty good job of recruiting students, especially undergraduate students, but lags in the recruitment and retention of faculty. And, it's not a kind of holistic approach that's being taken, right? And so our students, I think, like you at their age, are hungry for this knowledge, right? And they're hungry to build community. And I think they do a really good job of helping to kind of build those bonds amongst each other, right? And to craft out those spaces of community and of belonging, even when it doesn't seem like the university is supportive of that, right? But I think that making the connection to that, to the kind of like the scholarly side of things, right? In terms of like really creating those spaces for intellectual belonging within the university, and making Latinx studies matter beyond the kind of like confines of our unit and of the Latinx students who are here. That's another kind of struggle that's connected to this.
Well, a couple of things. I always think of what is the purpose of things. And so from what I have seen traveling around the country and speaking to students is the university for Latinx students is extremely important to learn about who we are and our history. So many young people come in and like myself didn't know our history because it's not being taught in the high schools or in the primary schools. In New York City, we don't have Puerto Rican history still in the high schools. Yeah. So you have teachers individually, but it's not part of the curriculum.
Yeah.
So
it's just wild.
It's incredible, you know. It's the largest Puerto Rican community, you know, was till recently in the United States, and they don't have the history. So we have a choice then. Well, we have several choices, actually. One is we have to take responsibility for it and try and do the best that we can to make sure that it's not lost, whether it's films or books or workshops or public libraries or whatever it is that we need to do. Two, we need to fight the powers that be for the resources that we need. And that's a whole other set of bringing people together and, you know, time commitment. The other thing that I find is that scholars have changed because you now have, from my eyes, a huge network of Latinx scholars that did not exist 50 years ago.
Sure.
And as I often say, I hope to one day have a Latinx professor take a class that I can have. I go around saying, can I take your class? Because I never had. I feel like that's on my bucket list. Let's put it that way.
Come to Iowa for a semester. You can take a class.
So, but the scholars then become very important. Yeah. And I think among the scholars today, it divides into the two. You have the scholars that take on the responsibility and lovingly help bring younger scholars along. And then you have the scholars that get into contemplating their navel. And I don't mean to be highly critical, but, you know, that doesn't suit our purpose as a people.
Yeah.
I really believe that if we are guided by our history and by the needs of our people, first of all, our sheer numbers are going to make us heard. It's not like they declare a party and they say, okay, now you can come in to the scholarship. Right. And what have we done? We've created great journals of our own, great books of our own, great conferences of our own. We don't always have to feel like we need to belong there. Maybe they need to belong where we are.
Yeah.
Maybe they need to say, you know, we would like to be where you are. And more importantly, maybe we need to create a bigger book that includes everything that needs to be included and includes us as well. Because, you know, in all my study of history, and I call myself an independent scholar, and all that I try and do is I try and create a space for us.
Yeah.
You know, for Puerto Rican history, for feminist history, for coalitions, the importance of coalitions, recognizing our international relationship to other poor people around the world, recognizing that who's suffering first, who's been suffering this climate injustice, who's been the global South, who's been, right? And that'll take me to Hurricane Maria. I know we weren't supposed to talk about that, but I can't help myself talk about the importance of what is happening in Puerto Rico and how proud I was to see the governor, the people tell the governor, get out of town, and he had to he had to get out of town. He resisted. And then he was such a coward. He went on, Facebook to say, Facebook to say, I think I'm leaving on Friday, so that he could have time between now and Friday to destroy all his corruption documents, right? So he could shred everything that he had done, including calling women whores and, everything else that he and talking about with his buddies of throwing the cadavers of people who had died during Maria to the cows. I mean, despicable stuff that we now see happening all over Latin America. Mm-hmm. We're in a period where, what we say matters, although we don't always know if what is being said is true.
Yeah.
Right? People even questioning, is there anything such thing as truth? And then we get all confused. So we have to find anchor points. I always look for anchor points when I'm spiraling out of control. And to me, like my mother becomes, sometimes I need to visualize somebody. Mm-hmm. And in my writing, I do that. I visualize a young student that I want to read this, or I think about my mom, who had third grade education and was orphaned and taken out of school, and who always encouraged me to get an education. Estudia, don't be like me, right?
I may have heard those same things as a kid.
Yes. So imagine that hope in us, and then we have to carry that hope forward.
Right.
We have to take it forward and not take it for granted. Sometimes when we gain something, we take it for granted. And so I think it's the scholars also have to take that responsibility, because it was a scholar that influenced you. Mm-hmm. It was a scholar that influenced me.
Yeah.
And that they saw part of their, it wasn't, it was part of their being to inform, to educate, to, motivate, to bring, to offer gifts of knowledge that we didn't have.
Yeah, that's great. Inspiring words. I thank you so much for being here with me, and for agreeing to sit down for the podcast, and for visiting Iowa and doing the film screening later today. I mean, this episode will air next month in January, but your words and your advice and your wisdom are timeless, of course.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So, we'd love to hear your thoughts on Twitter. We're at Imagining Lat for the podcast. And if you'd like to engage us via email, you can shoot us one at podcast@imagininglatinidades.com. I will be sure to put up links to Edith Morales' work, to Red Sugar Cane Press, and other things that we've talked about in the show notes. So please be sure to check those. Please also share this podcast with friends, and subscribe. Subscription is so important. The more people subscribe, the more it helps to kind of give us visibility. It doesn't hurt to get 5-star ratings, so please do that as well if you are so inclined. Thanks for listening in, and again, please check the show notes for all the links and sites that we mentioned today. Thank you again for being with us.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, y'all.